The first phase is the legal phase. This is where you establish the framework. It is decided who is the entity responsible for registration, which could be the election management body. It could be a Ministry of Interior if it is decided that the voter register is extracted from the civil register. There should also be an entity responsible for adjudication of complaints. In many cases, that is not the same as the election management body. It may be that it is the normal judicial system, or it could be a separate entity that will deal with complaints in relation to voter registration, the election itself, etc. The legal framework should also establish the eligibility criteria for registration. It should define is it citizens? Is it what are the age criteria? How do we break it down into smaller constituencies for parliamentary elections, for local elections, etc.? This is all something that is normally decided by Parliament. My personal opinion is that it is completely acceptable for an election management body to play a very strong role in this. So the involvement starts already here. Of course, not in a political sense, but in terms of, shall we say, advising the political decision makers on what can work and what can't work, what makes sense. We have talked previously about incentives for registration, incentives for voting, and I think this is something that an election management body, with its experience, it can greatly help the decision makers in deciding what the law should look like. In terms of voter registration specifically, the process as such should also have a legal foundation. That can be through registration law, or it could be through regulations and procedures. Again, my personal preference is that the overall framework is decided by law, but that the law also mandates and obligates an election management body to issue regulations about the specifics about how a registration, or for that matter, an election is conducted. So again, the election management body plays a very strong role here. The next phase is planning. And in my opinion, this is really where the battle is won or lost. If the planning isn't conducted properly, then you have the risk of the voter registration and hence the entire election falling apart. This is probably the most important phase. Often the emphasis is on the actual registration where you're out and you're meeting the registrants. But if you have failed in a planning phase, then everything else is at risk. I said before that the process is defined by law or regulation. Well, again, the election management body may have to go into more detail about this, create procedures, and be very specific about the process. It will also need to address issues like early voting, special needs voting, etc., that may not be determined by law, but is important for the inclusiveness of the electorate. The timeline is, of course, an important element of the planning phase, where you decide how much time is allocated to each of the phases. If the registration is conducted too fast, then you will end up in a situation where you're not ready for the elections, and we'll come back to what you can do then. And if you start too early, well, then the incentive for registration may be lost, because people are simply not interested until you're closer to election day. The planning is very much about procurement, and as Carlos pointed out, this is something that can take a really long time. So you want to start early. You want to find out what is it you want to procure in terms of the central systems, the registration kits, whether these are computerized, it is forms, etc. You may need to do some in-house development. You can buy package solutions, or you can do them in-house. Under all circumstances, most solutions will have to be tailored to the specifics of your country, because there are no two scenarios that are exactly the same. You'll need to identify the registration locations. Again, depending on how this is done, it can be in municipal offices, or you can use registration centers. These registration centers may end up being polling centers. And again, this is where it is good to look ahead and look at several election cycles, because the polling locations that may work for a presidential election may not be appropriate for municipal or local elections, which will be your next cycle. And if there's something that's confusing to voters, then it is that they don't go to the same polling station every time there's a new election. So planning ahead will greatly enhance your chances of success, not only for one election cycle, but for the subsequent ones. You'll also need to recruit the registration staff, find out who is it you want to use. You may need to enter into agreements, for example, with the Ministry of Education if you use teachers, which is very common. So you want to do this well ahead. The next phase is training and voter education. This is where you go out and you tell the electorate when will registration take place, where will it take place, what are the eligibility criteria, so that they know whether to participate or not. For example, in some countries, you need to be 18 in order to vote, but you may register people already when they're 16, so that your register can be used for a couple of elections. This is a very important public information message. You may also have staggered registration, which means that you need to tell different parts of the country about different timings. You need to train your registration staff. This is typically a very large number of people, and therefore quite time-consuming, because you can't bring thousands and thousands of people into one place and train them all at once. One solution to overcoming this is cascade training, where you start at the top and you train the trainers and you disseminate the training message down through the ranks. Then you have the training and capacity building of headquarters staff. Now, of course, that goes for all the staff, but in relation to voter registration in particular, this is very much focused on IT staff. We have, again, as international advisors, been out, and sometimes we see that roles of conducting the first elections has been done either by internationals as support, or even by vendors. When you've bought a system, you also get some support in setting the systems up and making them run, and maybe even implement them for the first election. In order to have sustainable registers, it is crucial that you use the first election cycle to build the capacity of the election management body to control this process themselves. Implementation, well, we talked about the procurement, also bringing things in, setting them up, installing servers, bringing in registration kits, testing them, preparing them for the field, can be quite time-consuming, and there needs to be an allowance for this. I put it as the last point, a pilot. if you do something for the first time, in particular if you use technology for the first time, I would strongly recommend that you do a pilot project. You can even do it in an earlier election cycle. We've seen that if you do normal paper-based registration, then maybe you pick one district to test a new electronic biometric registration kit so that you have a fallback position. Going out for one time-critical election with a new technology, as for example, very expensive computerized biometric registration kits, and think that you can push these out in a vast country under problematic conditions and think that it will all work, is optimistic at best. Doesn't mean that it can't happen, but I would rather have a pilot to find out what are the weaknesses and then adjust accordingly. Of course,